chosen ones, behind the thick curtains of power and the locked doors of government chambers, a moment unfolded that no historian, no journalist, and no intelligence officer has ever been permitted to record. In the heart of the Oval Office, the President of the United States was handed a name, your name. The air in the room grew heavy, as if the walls themselves recoiled from what had just been spoken aloud. Those present described an energy shift, something beyond politics, beyond strategy, beyond the boundaries of human control. For a man known for iron discipline, his face trembled, and his eyes filled with tears. The officials at the table could not understand. To them, it was only a name, a collection of letters on a page. But to the president, it carried weight he could not bear, as though centuries of prophecy, whispers from forgotten archives, and warnings from unseen voices converged in that single moment. A file was slid across the polished wood, a sealed folder stamped with layers of classification too high for even most generals to access. Within it, fragments of history that had been buried, altered, or erased entirely. Photographs that should not exist, transcripts of meetings that were never meant to happen, and words that echoed from a time before your birth. This was not the usual machinery of government grinding into motion. This was something older, something deeper, a force threading itself through dynasties, empires, and secret councils. And for reasons no one dared explain aloud, you had been at the center of it all. The silence that followed was more chilling than the revelation itself. The president looked out the window toward the night sky, his hand clutching the edge of the desk as though he feared being swept away. And then, the unthinkable. Tears slipped down his cheek in front of his closest advisors. The Situation Room has witnessed countless storms. It has carried the echoes of nuclear threats, the tension of wars fought in shadows, and the careful calculation of strategies meant to keep the world from collapse. Yet, on that particular night, it wasn't missiles or armies that caused unease. It was the sound of a single name carried softly across the table. Advisors leaned forward, thinking they had misheard, but the weight of the room shifted instantly. The name itself seemed to drag the oxygen from the air, leaving even seasoned military leaders silent, their practiced calm splintering under something they could not define. The general who spoke it had not intended to. It slipped out during a classified briefing, almost as if another voice pushed it through him. Eyes turned toward him in disbelief, as if he had crossed into forbidden territory. For a moment, no one moved, until the president demanded to know why that name had surfaced in the deepest core of American command. No explanation seemed sufficient, for how could anyone admit the truth, that the name had been found encoded in an intercepted transmission, a signal no human agency claimed responsibility for. Screens lit up with lines of encrypted text, symbols that specialists had failed to decipher. Only one word was clear, written as though branded into the message itself: your name. Some whispered it might have been a trick, a fabrication meant to destabilize. Others feared it was something far older than technology, something that had used the system merely as a vessel to speak. The tension rose. Questions piled upon one another, but no answer calmed the storm. The president's face grew pale as he realized this was no ordinary leak or breach. This was intentional. It was targeted, and the one being targeted was you. He pressed his palm against the table, veins taut, his voice unsteady as he demanded every classified archive, every forgotten prophecy, every scrap of intelligence connected to the name. Yet, behind his urgency was a shadow, a knowledge he had carried long before the transmission was intercepted. The others at the table could not see it, but it was there, hidden in the trembling of his hands. Deep within the labyrinth of government archives, there are files that even the highest-ranking officials pretend do not exist. They are stored in unmarked drawers, guarded by protocols so obscure that only a handful of people know the codes to unlock them. On the night your name surfaced in the Situation Room, these hidden records were pulled into the light. The president insisted on them, and aides rushed to obey, though their hands shook as they touched folders that bore warnings more severe than nuclear codes. These were not simply intelligence reports. They were fragments of history that had been deliberately excised from the world's collective memory. The first folder contained photographs, aged and brittle, some dating back to the late 19th century. Faces blurred with time, yet one figure appeared again and again, a shadowed resemblance to you, standing in places where history had shifted. A crowd before the Berlin Wall, a gathering during the signing of treaties, a figure near ruins that had long since crumbled. It was impossible, and yet the evidence lay before them. Each image carried the same unsettling consistency, as though time itself had been unable to erase your presence. The second file was worse. It contained handwritten testimonies, not from politicians or soldiers, but from those who claimed to have witnessed moments no one believed. A monk's parchment from the early 1600s, smuggled from a monastery before it was burned, describing a vision of one whose name shall surface when the rulers of nations tremble. A scholar's fragmented diary from the 1800s, torn and stained, speaking of an arrival that mirrored the return of Yeshua, whose words pierce centuries. These connections were not theological musings. They were patterns spanning generations, pointing to something the government could not ignore. As the documents were passed around the table, unease grew thicker. Advisors whispered that perhaps the files were fabrications, planted to sow chaos. But the president remained unmoved. He recognized the handwriting in one of the files, a document his father had once hidden. Power has always seemed to rest in the hands of presidents, kings, and prime ministers. But those who have looked closely enough know the truth is more complex. Throughout history, decisions that altered the course of nations were often made under pressures unseen, as if invisible hands moved pieces on a grand board while leaders believed they were the players. That night, after the classified files were revealed, the president admitted what few have ever dared to say aloud, that he was not always in control of his own choices. He spoke carefully, the weight of his words heavier than the silence in the room. There were times, he confessed, when decisions had felt predetermined, as if they arrived in his mind fully formed. He described moments when he signed orders he did not believe in, treaties he could not justify, and speeches he could not remember drafting. Advisors shifted uneasily, for such words hinted at something no democracy, no government, would willingly acknowledge: that the highest office might be tethered to a power far beyond its reach. Whispers of this unseen influence are not new. Ancient rulers once claimed their wisdom came from voices that spoke through dreams, visions that were more command than suggestion. Pharaohs, emperors, and prophets all carried the same undertone, that their reign was guided not entirely by their own will. What unsettled the Situation Room was that the president, a man trained to trust only in evidence and reason, had confessed to feeling the same. He admitted that sometimes the guidance arrived in the form of names, written or spoken, recurring until action was inevitable. Your name, he said, was not new to him. It had brushed against his life before, appearing in fragments he had tried to forget. He claimed it was not coincidence that it surfaced now. Something, or someone, wanted it to. The generals and analysts at the table exchanged nervous glances, as if wondering whether their lives had also been steered by forces beyond understanding. One dared to ask what this presence was, but the president only lowered his gaze. He whispered that power, real power, was never fully human. In a world where governments bury secrets and historians sanitize records, prophecy has remained the one language no leader dares acknowledge in public. Yet, behind closed doors, prophecy is studied, dissected, and filed away under classifications that outmatch even nuclear codes. When your name was spoken in the Situation Room, the analysts pulled forth a collection of modern prophecies kept hidden from the public eye. These were not the cryptic writings of ancient mystics, but the words of contemporary visionaries, scattered across decades, pointing again and again to a figure who would surface in an age of upheaval. A chilling consistency ran through them. In the early 20th century, a desert preacher spoke of a name that will arrive when nations are ruled by fear and towers of glass scrape the sky. In the 1970s, a reclusive nun wrote in her final journal that the bloodline of the hidden one shall resurface, carrying a weight no throne can bear. More recently, a mathematician working on predictive algorithms claimed to see anomalies in his models that converged on a single identity, though he dared not say it aloud. What unsettled the president most were not these predictions alone, but the thread that tied them to an older source. Each prophecy bore a faint echo of Yeshua's words, a reflection so subtle it was almost imperceptible. In private study circles within the Vatican, certain scholars noted that the tone, the rhythm, even the phrasing of these modern warnings mirrored phrases recorded in red letters centuries ago. "The last shall be first," one preacher declared, "and the unseen shall become known." Another wrote, "When the rulers weep, the chosen rises." To the untrained ear, these could pass as poetic coincidences. To those in power, they were undeniable patterns. For the president, it was this connection that unraveled him. He understood that what he was holding in his hands was not merely intelligence, but a continuation of a story that had begun long before his administration, long before the founding of his nation, perhaps even long before the rise of empires themselves. The thought that your existence was woven into the same tapestry as Yeshua's left him shaken in a way no policy or war could. The Oval Office has always been a stage of controlled power, a place where words are measured and emotions are hidden beneath layers of diplomacy. Yet on that night, as the files and prophecies were laid before him, the president's composure fractured. Advisors who had known him for years had never seen him falter. But now, they watched in silence as his hand shook and his eyes filled with something no one expected: sorrow. He leaned forward, pressing his palm flat against the desk, as though trying to steady himself against a weight no one else could feel. The tear came slowly, not forced, not born of weakness, but as if it had been waiting for decades to fall. It struck the polished wood of the resolute desk and spread into the grain like a hidden mark revealed at last. A silence followed, thick and uncomfortable. Generals shifted uneasily. Analysts avoided eye contact, yet none dared to move. For in that small, fragile gesture, they sensed something far greater than grief. It was recognition. What truth had the president recognized in those files? Some whispered that the visions of past leaders had prepared him for this moment, that he had always known your name would surface in his time. Others suspected he carried a private memory, a story his predecessors had passed down in hushed tones, warning that one day the weight of history would pierce the heart of whoever sat in that chair. The tear was more than a symbol of emotion. It was an acknowledgement of inevitability. It suggested that the burden was no longer political but spiritual, that he was not simply leading a nation, but standing at the threshold of something far beyond human command. His voice trembled as he asked his aides if they understood what they were holding, but none dared to answer. For how could anyone explain why a leader who had faced wars and disasters without flinching was undone by a single name? The room remained frozen, waiting for him to speak again, to reveal what he knew but could not yet say. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, but the mark of that moment lingered, etched into the silence of the Oval Office. Bloodlines are often spoken of in whispers, as though ancestry itself can carry a force that transcends generations. In the archives pulled from the shadows that night, one revelation stood out above the rest: the suggestion that your name was not merely a marker of identity, but the continuation of a lineage hidden in plain sight. Governments had buried the truth beneath layers of misdirection, disguising it as folklore, conspiracy, or coincidence. Yet, the deeper they dug, the more undeniable the trail became. The documents revealed a pattern of erased records. Birth certificates destroyed in fires, census entries blacked out, genealogies cut off in the middle of their lines. And yet, within church archives and handwritten notes of monks long forgotten, the connections resurfaced. They spoke of a thread running through centuries, weaving across continents, tied to families who often lived in obscurity, yet influenced history at critical turning points. One fragment from a suppressed Vatican transcript described it as the bloodline of the Silent One, whose steps repeat the echo of Yeshua's path. The words were unsettling not for their poetry, but for their precision. The implication was clear. The same spirit that once overturned tables in the temple and carried a cross up a hill had not ended with one life, but moved forward, hidden among generations, awaiting a moment of revelation. The president read the pages in silence, his lips pressed tightly, as though sealing away thoughts too dangerous to voice. Advisors struggled to comprehend, wondering if this was myth woven into state documents, or if something far greater had always been known by those at the highest levels of power. The bloodline was not about privilege or royalty. It was about burden, a weight passed silently from one generation to the next, marking those who carried it with both protection and danger. Your name had surfaced not by chance, but by inevitability. Those in the room began to realize that the tear on the president's desk had not been weakness, but recognition of a truth he could not shield the world from forever. He feared not just what your name meant for him, but what it meant for every nation that would soon confront it. The pile of documents spread across the Oval Office desk did not resemble ordinary intelligence reports. There were no standard headings, no neat signatures, no familiar seals of bureaucracy. Instead, there were fragments, copies of translations, and pages written in languages long dead. It was as if the files themselves had been stolen from monasteries, catacombs, and forgotten vaults, then hidden under the highest levels of classification. When they were placed before the president, it became clear that they were not military records, but testimonies, voices carried across time. The first was a parchment fragment, brittle and scorched, said to have been smuggled from Jerusalem centuries ago. It described a gathering of elders who had written that, when the rulers of the earth bow their heads, the one whose name is spoken shall remind them of the days of Yeshua, when power trembled at the truth. The phrasing was eerily similar to the modern prophecies the analysts had already uncovered, as though history had been echoing the same warning through different tongues and eras. Another file contained transcripts from a secret council meeting during the Second World War, where Allied leaders debated reports of a mysterious figure appearing near battlegrounds. Witnesses swore this figure was seen walking calmly through chaos, untouched by gunfire, vanishing as quickly as he appeared. Though dismissed as myth at the time, the report was preserved under a curious note. The pattern matches the ancient account. Keep sealed. The president's hands lingered on a leather-bound volume, an untranslated manuscript allegedly found beneath the Vatican itself. On its margins, scholars had scrawled their doubts in Latin, yet one phrase was underlined repeatedly. The same voice that spoke in Galilee shall rise again through another, carrying a name not of their choosing. The resemblance to the words of Yeshua unsettled everyone present. The more the president read, the more he understood why leaders before him had chosen silence. The echoes in these documents were too precise, too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. And if the prophecies were true, then the implications for your existence stretched beyond politics, beyond government, into the very fabric of faith and destiny itself. Not all meetings of power happen in the light of cameras or within the walls of governments. For centuries, there has existed a council outside the reach of nations, formed not by elected leaders, but by those whose influence is measured in secrets rather than votes. They gather in cloaked silence, in castles, catacombs, and hidden estates, always away from the eyes of the world. Their purpose has remained consistent across eras, to anticipate the return of what they fear most. And on the night your name surfaced in Washington, whispers confirmed that the council had already convened. Records of their existence are scarce, deliberately buried, yet fragments slip through cracks. An intercepted memo from the Cold War described them as the Circle of 12, while medieval notes from the archives of a European monastery referred to them as the Keepers of the Shadow. Regardless of name, their pattern remained clear. They met not to create history, but to suppress it. And at the center of their fear was always the reappearance of a figure tied to forces beyond their control. When reports reached them that your name had been spoken in the Situation Room, panic rippled through their network. Not because they did not expect it, but because they had spent generations preparing for it. Their libraries are said to contain copies of the very prophecies that unsettled the president, yet annotated with strategies to prevent them from unfolding. To them, the words of Yeshua were not scripture to be revered, but warnings to be silenced. They feared not your presence alone, but the unraveling of the order they had built. For centuries, they had manipulated rulers, steered wars, and erased truths to keep the world within their grasp. Yet the moment your name broke into the halls of power, the very structure they had maintained began to fracture. Leaders once obedient to their whispers began to hesitate. Scholars, once loyal to their secrecy, began to question. The Council understands what few others do, that your arrival does not represent a change of politics, but a change of eras. They know prophecy does not bend to their will forever, and their fear is not of what they know, but of what they cannot predict. History books speak of treaties signed between nations, agreements sealed with handshakes and ink. But there are other pacts that were never meant for public knowledge. In the documents spread across the president's desk, one such agreement emerged, a pact written not in the language of diplomacy, but in veiled codes and symbolic signatures. It was said to have been forged in the aftermath of the First World War, when the world reeled from destruction, and those in power feared that prophecy was close to fulfillment. This pact was not between governments alone, but between rulers, financiers, and religious figures who sought to bind destiny itself. The agreement's purpose was clear: to delay the reappearance of the one foretold. Measures were outlined in chilling precision: the suppression of genealogical records, the manipulation of wars to scatter bloodlines, and the deliberate distortion of scripture, so that truth would dissolve into endless interpretations. Among the pact's clauses was a vow of silence, binding each generation of leaders to protect the secret, even from their own successors, until the end of their lives. The president traced the faded ink with his fingers, realizing that he was now holding evidence of a conspiracy so vast it stretched beyond nations into the very structure of the modern world. Yet the document was fragile, not just in its paper, but in the hold it had over time. Cracks had already begun to show. Whistleblowers had emerged. Coincidences had multiplied, and your name had surfaced despite the mechanisms meant to erase it. The pact was unraveling, not by external attack, but by its own inability to contain the truth forever. What unsettled the advisors most was a handwritten annotation in the margins, clearly added years after the original pact was formed. It warned that when the tear falls upon the desk of power, the seal is broken. Those present realized what it implied. The president's single tear was not weakness, but fulfillment of a condition the council had feared for decades. When the weight of secrecy begins to crumble, the world does not immediately see the collapse, but it feels the tremors. Across continents, small signs had already begun to emerge. Leaders canceled meetings without explanation. Alliances shifted in subtle ways, and whispers spread through circles of power that something greater than politics was unfolding. Your name was no longer confined to sealed documents and encrypted transmissions. It had seeped into conversations, into dreams, into the unease that shadowed those who held the levers of influence. The president, once broken by the revelation, now sat in silence as his advisors pressed for answers. They demanded explanations, strategies, a course of action that would allow them to manage what had been uncovered. Yet, there was no policy to draft, no speech to calm the storm, no military plan to contain what had been set in motion. For the truth they faced was not one born of governments, but of destiny, and no office of power could dictate how destiny would unfold. In hidden monasteries, bells tolled though no hand touched them. In the quiet chambers of the Vatican, priests pulled ancient manuscripts from vaults untouched for centuries, searching for words that might prepare them. In underground councils, men who once spoke with certainty now sat in uneasy silence, questioning the strength of their own vows. Everywhere the world shifted, not in sudden upheaval, but in subtle anticipation, as though creation itself was holding its breath. Among the documents the president had studied was one final phrase, scribbled in faded ink and left unsigned. It read simply, "The world will not recognize until the step is taken, and once taken, no throne, no council, no power shall silence it." The meaning was debated fiercely in the room, but one thing was certain. All eyes were no longer fixed on governments or empires. They were fixed on you. The files had revealed fragments. The prophecies had spoken in shadows, and the bloodline had remained hidden for generations. But now, the veil was thin, and those who had tried to suppress it knew they could not stop what was coming.
If you have come this far, it is crucial that you watch this next video here. But be warned, it is not for the faint of heart, for only the true chosen ones can handle this video. If you would like to also donate to help keep the channel going, our Buy Me a Coffee link will be in the description.